In accordance with Standing Order 43, the time for members' statements has concluded. Questions without notice. The Leader of the Opposition.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Can the Prime Minister confirm that Australia has plunged into the worst recession in almost a century?
The Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, this is a devastating day for Australia. The COVID-19 global recession and pandemic that has impacted the world has impacted Australia. Australians know that's the case, Mr Speaker. Australians know, Mr Speaker, that many, many months ago that this day would come, and this day has come. And, Mr Speaker, as the pandemic continues to have its impact, not just here, Mr Speaker, but all around the world, there will be further difficult days ahead. And that is why the government acted with the most unprecedented, Mr Speaker, act of intervention to support Australians in their time of need. And as harsh and as severe and as heavy as this blow is on Australia today, Mr Speaker, we know that as a government that we have acted to seek to cushion that blow as much as we possibly can. And that has been done at a great cost and a price, Mr Speaker, worth paying for the peace of mind, for the assurance and for the confidence of Australians that despite these heavy times, they know that the government has stood up and been there. But not just for today, Mr Speaker, not just for today, but for the future as well. Because Australia will recover and Australia will grow again, and the jobs will come back and they will support the lives and livelihoods of Australians as they have in the past. And our plan for that to occur, Mr Speaker, that plan is built on the resilience and the strength and the enterprise of the Australian people. The businesses that they run and the jobs that they have in those businesses and the efforts that they will put in, whether it's the skills that they need, the infrastructure they need, whether it is being able to keep more of what they earn and have the hard-earned reward for their effort, and ensure that they can have available to them in their own lives and in their businesses to invest back in their future, to ensure that our federation works better, to ensure the many projects that are necessary, whether it's on water or on energy or on transport, that they will continue to be rolled out. Almost $10 billion of infrastructure brought forward just for the purpose of supporting those jobs, Mr Speaker. The energy costs that must come down and have been coming down, Mr Speaker, but more importantly, what will support affordable and reliable energy into the future to drive those businesses into the future. Mr Speaker, this is the JobMaker plan the government has been rolling out and will continue to roll out, and Australians can rely on, because they know when Australia is under economic threat, then the wise and experienced hands of economic management matter, Mr Speaker, and that is what the Australian people know of this government. But today, for them, it is a heavy day, and we stand with them.
The member for Fisher.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Will the Prime Minister update the House on how the COVID-19 recession, confirmed by today's national accounts, is impacting Australian workers and businesses, and how the Morrison government's JobMaker plan is working to cushion this terrible impact and provide the pathway to recovery?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. As I have just said, this is a devastating day for Australia. Our Australian economy has been savaged by the COVID-19 global pandemic and recession. Mr Speaker, it is delivering an awful and heartbreaking blow to Australians and their families all around the country. Australians know why we are now in a COVID-19 recession, and they also know, as the government has known, that this day, as I said, would come. The government has acted to protect lives and livelihoods promptly, long before the numbers presented today, Mr Speaker, to suppress the virus and to cushion the heavy economic blow. More than 1 million Australians are out of work, Mr Speaker, but as Treasury advisers, because of the actions taken by the government, that number could be 700,000 more. And we also know that we have avoided even more severe impacts, as we've seen in other places. But that, Mr Speaker, is no comfort to the Australians who are dealing with a heavy blow today It is no comfort to them that Australia, of course, because of how we've responded, has meant that we've been able to cushion the blow. The blow is still great. And, Mr Speaker, as we have acted in this way, I know that that impact is still bitter and it is still real. And so we will continue to work, not just on cushioning that blow, but on the road back and on the road beyond, to open up Australia, to ensure that we are not that dislocated nation. A dislocated nation, Mr Speaker, is not success. That is a continued resignation to the virus. And Australia will not resign to this virus, Mr Speaker, and our economy will not resign to this virus. Mr Speaker, what we will do is to continue to believe in Australians and their resilience and their enterprise. We will build, Mr Speaker. We will make it easier for businesses to employ and to invest and to get Australians back into jobs as they lead the recovery, Mr Speaker, the businesses of Australia, bringing the workers of Australia together with them, Mr Speaker, as we go forward. And we will ensure that because of their effort, Mr Speaker, our government will ensure that they get the rewards of their effort and they will keep more of what they earn, Mr Speaker, and that they can rest assured in the essential services that we will guarantee so they can rely on them, Mr Speaker, and we will continue to be stronger and safer and together.
The Leader of the Opposition.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. 1 million Australians are unemployed. Another 400,000 will be out of work by Christmas, and Australia is in the worst recession in almost a century. Isn't this the worst time for the Prime Minister to be cutting JobKeeper, cutting JobSeeker and cutting wages of some of the poorest workers in this country?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I look forward to the day in Australia, and because of the economic plan the government will continue to implement in partnership with the states and territories, I look forward to the day when our economy will not need JobKeeper. I look forward to the day, Mr Speaker, when we will not need the extraordinary supports that our government have provided. But we did not hesitate to provide them, Mr Speaker. We did not hesitate to provide them, Mr Speaker. And I note the jeers and the laughter of those opposite on the most devastating day for Australia, Mr Speaker, we have seen in our economy, and I note the politicking of those opposite, Mr Speaker, on this day. The only people who seem to be in a pleasant state of mind today, Mr Speaker, is the opposition. Because, Mr Speaker, on such a devastating day, our government, Mr Speaker, will continue to focus on the plan and the response that we have provided in a measured and carefully architected way, Mr Speaker, and that plan has been working. More than 700,000 Australians would have been added to the number that the Leader of the Opposition refers to. And our plans, Mr Speaker, will continue to deliver on these urgent tasks. But JobKeeper has been extended, it has been expanded, and it will continue to be provided, Mr Speaker. JobKeeper must be transitioned, and I refer to the words of the Leader of the Opposition himself, Mr Speaker. In what he said, we obviously do need to shift away. The mechanisms won't be in place forever, Mr Speaker. He said, but with JobKeeper, the fact is it needs a transition, Mr Speaker. The each-way bets of the Leader of the Opposition. He says JobKeeper should be extended, but it should be transitioned. He said it should be higher, and he says it should be lower, Mr Speaker. What the Australian people know is the each-way bet plan of the Leader of the Opposition is no one that you can trust in a crisis, Mr Speaker. He is not someone who can be relied upon, Mr Speaker. He is not someone, despite his many years in this place where he considers himself the Prince of the Parliament, Mr Speaker. He has spent more time taking points of order than he sat in a Budget Expenditure Review Committee.
The member for Ryan.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and my question is to the Treasurer. Will the Treasurer update the House on today's national account figures and how the Morrison government is working to cushion the significant blow of the COVID-19 pandemic on Australian workers, families and businesses?
The Treasurer has the call.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Ryan for his question and commend his work in this place on behalf of his constituents and indeed all Australians. Mr Speaker, today we received devastating economic news. GDP fell in the June quarter by 7%. To put that in perspective, it was the single largest fall on record since the series began in 1959. Prior to today, the single largest fall was a 2% fall in 1974. Our record run as a nation of 28 years of consecutive years of economic growth has officially come to an end. And while we're talking about these numbers in this place, Australians are living these numbers. Because 1.3 million Australians lost their jobs or saw their hours reduced to zero since the start of this crisis. Now, the numbers we saw today here in Australia were very severe, were very hard to take. But we also know that COVID-19 has wreaked havoc around the rest of the world, and that the falls that we've seen in other economies have been more severe than what we saw today. In the United Kingdom, they are cold comfort. The member for Rankin is absolutely right. They are cold comfort for many people who are doing it tough, but they do indicate the significance of COVID-19 on global economies, and they also underscore the significance of the actions that we have taken and what they have delivered. The United Kingdom saw their GDP fall by more than 20%, France by around 14%, the United States by around 9.1%, Canada 11.5%, Germany around 10%. What we have seen around the world is devastating GDP numbers in June. But, Mr Speaker, we're focused on the road out, and this is the Job Maker Plan. Investing more in infrastructure, tax incentives for business to get them to invest, 340,000 new training places for people who need to reskill and re-equip themselves to get a job, and of course cutting red tape to make it easier to do business. Today was a hard day to take, but we are focused on the road out and getting Australians back to work.
The member for Rankin.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Won't the Prime Minister's decision this week to cut JobKeeper, cut JobSeeker and cut wages make the worst recession in almost a century even deeper and even longer?
The Treasurer.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. As you know, JobKeeper is at $101 billion, the single largest economic support program that this government, or indeed any Australian government, has ever undertaken. And right now it's supporting 3.5 million Australian workers and around 1 million businesses, Mr Speaker. And around the country, in every corner of this great country, there is a great story about JobKeeper and how it's keeping people in work. We've always said, though, the program was temporary, it was targeted, and that there would be a transition. Now, Mr Speaker, not just those on this side of the House have said that it should be tapered and it should come down, Mr Speaker. One person said this, that they should be looking at a kind of tapering, Mr Speaker. Somebody else said this about JobKeeper. There needs to be some transition over time away from these extraordinary levels of support in the economy, Mr Speaker. And the same person went on to say, which recognises that JobKeeper won't be there forever, Mr Speaker. The same person said, Mr Speaker, the government should be considering better ways to transition the JobKeeper program. Mr Speaker, that wasn't the member for Flinders. That wasn't the member for Wannon. That wasn't the member for... Mr Speaker,
Just
That
the
wasn't-
Treasurer, if you could just pause for a second, if members on my left could cease interjecting. I'm just going to say to the Treasurer, obviously, that the Hansard doesn't pick up his pauses. But
Sorry, Mr. Speaker.
I'm just going to draw him back to the question, which
So,
was—
Mr. Speaker—
No, hang on. I haven't ruled, OK? Unless you can read my mind. The question was quite specific, so whilst he can compare and contrast to an extent, he can't use the rest of the answer to speak about what the opposition's policies are.
I hadn't revealed who it was, Mr. Speaker, yet. But the
Treasurer can resume his seat. Just going to say to the Treasurer, it doesn't matter. The rules are quite clear, and I'm trying to maintain order in the House, and that can't just be when it suits those on my right. The Treasurer has the call.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Those comments were made by those opposite, but the point is that we are seeing this payment transition.
Member for McMahon is warned.
We are seeing this payment transition over time, but right now it's supporting 3.5 million workers. It's transitioning, it's tapering, just as the member for Rankin asked it to do.
I now call the member for Clark.
Mr. Speaker, my question is to the Prime Minister. Prime Minister, by one estimate, Australian retirees will be $135 billion worse off post-pandemic from reduced superannuation, personal savings, property income and share dividends. Fixing this will take bold reform, implemented urgently, including to the age pension, compulsory superannuation and voluntary savings. For example, the pension and compulsory super need to be increased, the assets and income tests and taper rates adjusted to stop penalising people for saving for retirement, the deeding rate lowered and eligibility expanded for the Commonwealth Seniors Health Card. To this end, Prime Minister, when will the Retirement Incomes Review be released? And do you commit to the bold
member for Clark's time has
to ensure a
concluded.
fair go for older Australians?
The Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for his question. The Retirement Income Review was handed to the government in late July 2020. Mr. Speaker, it was recommended by the Product Commission in its report Superannuation, Assessing Efficiency and Competitiveness. It was chaired by Mr Mike Callaghan with fellow panellists Carolyn Kay and Deborah Ralston. The review establishes a fact base to help improve understanding of how the Australian retirement income system is operating and how it will respond to an ageing society, as you indicated. It considers three pillars of the existing retirement income system: the age pension, compulsory super and voluntary savings. And the panel has identified four principles to use in assessing the performance of Australia's retirement income system: adequacy, equity, sustainability and cohesion, Mr. Speaker. It is very true that this devastating COVID-19 recession is going to have a significant impact on Australia's incomes today and will also impact on them in the longer term. That is also true in terms of the Commonwealth's finances and those of the states and territories. What we are investing today is to ensure that Australia can make its way through these most difficult of times. And in this most difficult of times, Mr. Speaker, it is true that the government has enabled people who are in hardship and distress to access their own money, their own savings, their own superannuation, to assist them to get through this very difficult time. Now, Mr. Speaker, the review that was initiated by the Treasurer will continue to be considered by the government, and will be released, Mr. Speaker, at a time when the government will be also making a response. And that is the normal process, Mr. Speaker. I remember when the Henry Tax Review was handed to the government, the Shadow Treasurer will remember that because he was working for the Treasurer at the time. They held on to it, Mr. Speaker, I think for about a year. And then they ignored it, Mr. Speaker. But, Mr. Speaker, I'm sorry, the Shadow Treasurer is correct. They didn't ignore it, Mr. Speaker. They introduced the mining tax that didn't raise any money, Mr. Speaker. That was another one of, I think, probably one of the genius recommendations from the Shadow Treasurer, whose training wheels were even bigger back then, Mr. Speaker, than they are now. But, Mr. Speaker, the matters raised by the member are very important, and we take them incredibly serious. In this House yesterday, I indicated that the unintended possible consequences of the indexation that applies to the pension, the government will be addressing it, and I want to assure pensioners to that end, Mr Speaker. And I want to assure those, as we were able to do at the last election, when those opposite sought to strip away from self-funded retirees their own earnings, Mr Speaker, and from their own superannuation, Mr Speaker. That's what those opposite think when it comes to people's savings, and these days they argue in this House that that money doesn't belong to them, but it belongs to industry fund managers.
The member for Bonner.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Treasurer. Will the Treasurer outline to the House how the Morrison government's economic support packages and our JobMaker program will support the Australian economy to recover and help families and businesses through the challenges of the COVID-19 recession?
Has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I thank the member for Bonner for his question and acknowledge his hard work on behalf of his constituents to ensure that they're able to get through the COVID-19 crisis. Mr Speaker, we saw this in today's national accounts, but we've been seeing it throughout the year, which is the havoc being wreaked by this once-in-a-century pandemic. To put it in context for the House, at the height of the GFC in 2009, the global economy contracted by 0.1%. That was the only time the global economy had contracted in 40 years. The OECD are now saying that the global economy will contract this year by a full 6%, Mr Speaker. And you have the World Bank saying that more economies will contract this year than at any time since 1870. And you've had the International Labour Organisation say that effectively 500 million full-time jobs have been lost globally as a result of COVID-19. Now, we approached this economic crisis from a position of strength, and we had delivered the first balanced budget in 11 years. We inherited an economy where unemployment was at 5.7 and we brought it down to 5.1. And we were able to respond by putting in place economic support measures like the JobKeeper program, like the cash flow boost, like the $550 coronavirus supplement, like new incentives for the instant asset write-off and the 50% accelerated depreciation. And the initiatives that we have seen on our watch have helped, according to Treasury, save 700,000 jobs. The unemployment rate was 7.5%. It's expected to go to around 10% by year's end, but it would be 5 percentage points higher but for the economic support that we have put in place. Now, Mr Speaker, we know that a quarter of the national economy is Victoria, and being subject to stage 4 restrictions has seen a huge drag on the national recovery. But our focus is on our JobMaker plan, bringing forward infrastructure investment of up to $10 billion, getting greater flexibility in the labour market like we did with the passage of the JobKeeper legislation just yesterday, 340,000 new training places, Mr Speaker, a skills package which is in partnership with the states and the territories through the good work of the Prime Minister and the National Cabinet. And then, of course, cutting red tape, which is making it easier for businesses to do business, Mr Speaker. Our focus is on helping Australians get back to work. The road to recovery will be long, the road to recovery will be hard, the road to recovery will be bumpy, but we will be with Australians every step of the way.
And I call the member for Sydney.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Tori from Lang Lang is a primary school relief teacher engaged by an agency. Tori's pregnant. She says the Prime Minister's cuts to the JobKeeper wage subsidy will be catastrophic for her. Why is this Prime Minister cutting JobKeeper for people like Tori in the middle of the worst recession in almost a century?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Mr Speaker, JobKeeper is a lifeline to Australians. It has been seeing Australians through, Mr Speaker, for the past almost 6 months, and it will be extended for a further 6 months. This is a program that taxpayers have willingly supported to the tune of around $11 billion every single month. And, Mr Speaker, as we move into the next phase of JobKeeper, what we are hoping to see is that fewer businesses will be dependent on that JobKeeper support. And in the period of after that, as we get into next year, that fewer businesses again will be needing that support. And what we hope to see, Mr Speaker, as our plan for the recovery and as the budget has its impact from October of this year and the many measures that have been introduced prior to that time, Mr Speaker, there will be more and more Australians who will be in a position where the companies that they work for will be able to support them with actual work and not be reliant on the economic income supports that are provided by the government. See, that is the goal. And that is why the transition plan is important, Mr Speaker, to ensure that our economy can move from a position of absolute supports to one to where it can stand on itself. Because, Mr Speaker, if you don't make that transition, the Australian economy won't be in that position to provide the support to Australians that it needs to provide. But the supports will remain, and the combination of JobKeeper together with JobSeeker will work together to ensure that the necessary income supports are in place for all Australians, as they have been from the start, Mr Speaker, and we will continue to calibrate these measures, as we have always done, in response to the economic circumstances that we face. And that has been one of the hallmarks of the government's response, to be balanced, to be carefully considered, to understand what can be sustained over the short, medium and the longer term, to put in place the supports that Australians need, but to also ensure that when businesses are in a position to employ again, that they can do so, and that they can bring people on, and they can bring hours back. And that's why we are pleased to see in the most recent payroll data, Mr Speaker, that there has been a recovery of half the jobs on payroll data, Mr Speaker, that were lost by women, and that we've seen particularly a bounce, a return, Mr Speaker, of those who are under 20 finding those jobs again. Now, there are many more jobs still to be created and returned to Australians, and that's what our plan will focus on. And to do that, we cannot remain behind, Mr Speaker, the constraints that have been limiting our economy to support the very people that the member refers to. Those constraints need to be lifted. We need to look forward, we need to look ahead, and we need to surge forward. We cannot hide behind this virus, Mr Speaker, with our economic plan. We must defeat it by ensuring that we allow our economy to grow again, and we lift the constraints on that economy.
Concluded. I call the member for Flynn.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Deputy Prime Minister, Minister for Infrastructure, Transport and Regional Development. Will the Deputy Prime Minister inform the House how the Morrison-McCormack government is supporting the creation of every possible regional job as part of the plan to support the Australian recovery from COVID-19 crisis?
The Deputy Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. On July 18 last year at Dubbo in the Member for Parkes electorate, the Daily Telegraph held its inaugural Bush Summit. And it was in the midst of one of the worst droughts that this nation had ever seen. And there was an air of doom and gloom over that gathering. Last Friday, in Cooma, the second Bush Summit was held, and whilst it was in the middle of a terrible global pandemic, there was an air of optimism and hope at that meeting. And those who attended felt as though the recovery was not far away. Certainly from the drought, and there's a sheen of green around the nation, and in many parts welcome rains have really helped our regional communities, and hopefully we'll get the best harvest we've had for many, many decades. And we know that many Australians today are hurting. Many Australians are mourning. But there is hope and help for them. There is optimism in sight. I know the member for Flynn works hard every day, certainly to create jobs and to build hope and optimism in his electorate. The fine people of Flynn know that the resources and agricultural sectors of central and northern Queensland are going to help our recovery efforts as we battle through COVID-19 and to make sure that we get through this together. And I know that mayors in his electorate, such as Kerry Hayes, who heads the Central Highlands Regional Council, he knows how important jobs are and certainly infrastructure stimulus is to the electorate, the fine electorate that the member for Flynn represents. He is very pleased that the federal government is investing $40 million in the Tambo-Springshaw Road. It's only 246 kilometres, where what we're doing is we're bituminising certain sections of that road. It's a cattle road. We're making sure, I don't know why you're yelling out, we're making sure that we're sealing sections of that road. We're putting bitumen down on that unsealed road to ensure that we create jobs. Don't take my word for it, Member for Hunter. You've got your own problems, mate. But certainly the Mayor Hayes says the Springshaw to Tambo Road effectively connects Western Queensland to the Port of Gladstone via our agricultural powerhouse. The inclusion of these Springshaw-Tambo road links in roads of strategic importance funding is a result of a combination of strategic advocacy by the member for Flynn, by the council, by local advocates, because they know that through this jobs are so important.
The Deputy Prime Minister's time has concluded. I call the member for Dunkley.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Noni from Carron Downs in my electorate works in the construction industry and says that she is barely able to make ends meet on the current JobKeeper rate. When the Prime Minister's cuts to JobKeeper kicks in this month, Noni says her family will have to live off savings and she's worried they won't last. Why is this Prime Minister cutting JobKeeper for people like Noni in the middle of the worst recession in almost a century?
The Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. There have been many measures that the government has introduced. JobKeeper has obviously been the most significant. But we also know that there are some sectors that were facing very significant additional impacts as a result of the COVID-19 recession. Australians know why the numbers on our economy are what they are today. Australians know that the COVID-19 recession has been produced by the global pandemic and the global recession that has followed from that. Australians know that. And, Mr Speaker, anyone who would seek to suggest that it is other than that clearly isn't living in the same country that the rest of us are, Mr Speaker, or in the same place. Mr Speaker, Australians know why. But Australians also know that we were quick to put in place JobKeeper. We were quick also, Mr Speaker, to put in place a very significant package for home builder, which was designed and is being effective, Mr Speaker, in ensuring that Australians who want to go and build homes, Mr Speaker, and do major renovations of their homes, Mr Speaker, are going to go about and they're going to do that. And we've seen that in Victoria, we've seen it in New South Wales, we've seen it particularly in Western Australia, Mr Speaker, where the program has been picked up and endorsed and supported by the Western Australian government, who have added to that project and have commended it for its timeliness and for its targeting, Mr Speaker. So whether it's the construction industry, whether it's the entertainment sector, Mr Speaker, whether it's the hospitality sector, whether it's the aviation sector in particular, Mr Speaker, these areas so significantly impacted, the government has stepped up and we've stepped in and we will stand with them each and every step of the way. But the path to recovery, Mr Speaker, will not be paved with endless support of the government. It will be paved with the endless effort of Australians and their enterprising spirit and restoring and building their businesses, whether they're a home-building business, whether they're a construction business, whether they're a transport business, Mr Speaker, whether they're an aviation sector or a retail business or whatever it is. Those businesses will drive those jobs and the incomes Australians will rely on, and that will drive our economy back, Mr Speaker, and we need to ensure the constraints are taken off them so they can get back to what they were doing, which is employing millions of Australians to support the very Australians that you're referring to. So JobKeeper will remain there, Mr Speaker, and as their businesses, including in the construction sector, which will be a priority area for opening up in Victoria, Mr Speaker, because that is an area where you can open up your residential construction in Victoria in a way that is both COVID-safe and high economic impact. And I've been, Mr Speaker, quite adamant about that being a key part of the Victorian reopening strategy, and I welcome the positive discussions I've had with the Premier about that very issue. That's where the jobs will come from, that's where the income will come from, by these businesses getting back on their feet and ensure that they can provide ongoing support for their employees.
Concluded. I call the member for North Sydney.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Health. Will the Minister please update the House on how the Morrison government is supporting the mental health and well-being of Australians during the COVID-19 pandemic and the COVID-19 recession?
The Minister for Health.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and I want to thank the member for North Sydney, who's been a passionate advocate for mental health, along with so many members of this House, indeed all members of this House. One of the reasons, of course, is that his electorate, like every electorate, has so many Australians who suffer with the challenges of mental health. In any one year, 4 million Australians will be struggling with some form of mental health challenge. Over the course of the life of this government, we've therefore invested, taking the resources available from about $3.4 billion to $5.7 billion, or a more than two-thirds increase. But this year has been a tough year. A global pandemic. More than 25.5 million people diagnosed now, and by the time this parliament reconvenes for the budget, most probably over 30 million. Most probably more than 1 million lives officially lost and many more lost. And Australia has not been immune to that. We know that the impact of this condition has had a profound health effect. 7 out of 8 states and territories have fortunately put themselves in a position where it has largely been defeated, but we are on watch. In Victoria, the challenge that we face, of course, is that the lockdowns have a profound impact on mental health, on the ability of people to exercise. Anxiety, depression, all of these elements are at risk. And that's why through the course of this pandemic we've invested very strongly. Firstly, and perhaps most importantly on a national basis, the creation of a 10-year plan for telehealth delivered in 10 days. Whole-of-population telehealth with now well over 28 million services, and mental health being a large part of that. As I mentioned, 59% of services for mental health in the last month in Victoria were delivered through telehealth. But in addition to that, there's been $74 million that's been invested specifically in support services. Beyond Blue, $10 million. $14 million for Lifeline and Kids Helpline, support for Origin and for, in particular, Headspace, Head to Health Online, and support for older Australians with the funding that's been provided to assist them with their mental health inreach. Within Victoria, we've doubled the number of MBS psychological services, and that's been a critical step forward, as well as making sure that we are investing in 15 new psychological and mental health centres that will be available not just now but over the course of the coming year and potentially beyond, I hope and expect. And that's an important investment in saving lives and protecting lives. It's a pandemic which has affected the world, but it's a pandemic where we have come into it with a plan to protect the lives and the mental health of Australians, and we will continue to fight to do that.
I now call the member for Blair.
Thank you. My question is to the Prime Minister. At JBS Meatworks in Dinmore, Queensland, more than 1,700 full-time workers are at risk of permanently losing their jobs because the Prime Minister has excluded them from JobKeeper. There are already 1 million Australians who are unemployed. Why is the Prime Minister adding these workers to the unemployment queue in the middle of the worst recession in almost a century?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. When JobKeeper was introduced, there were rules that were established to ensure that it was a targeted program, that it focused on particularly smaller and medium-sized businesses, and for large businesses with turnovers over $1 billion, it is available to those businesses where they have suffered a fall in their turnover of over 50%, Mr Speaker. And for other businesses, for smaller businesses and medium-sized businesses of more than 30%, I should stress. And that support through JobKeeper, Mr Speaker, has been supporting almost 1 million businesses across the country and some 3.6 million employees across the country. But JobKeeper was not the only support that the government introduced. In fact, our first response was to ensure that we strengthened the job seeker support for those who would become unemployed as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic and the COVID-19 recession, Mr Speaker, that we knew would result as a result of the global pandemic and the global economic impacts. So, Mr Speaker, we put those in place. And today it is still the case that job seeker is there in an elevated format, Mr Speaker, in a way that will provide support to Australians who find themselves out of employment. What I also know, Mr Speaker, is that as a result of the intervention undertaken by the government, that some 700,000 additional Australians, we are advised by Treasury, would have also found themselves unemployed were it not for the interventions that the government undertook. Now, Mr Speaker, these very large businesses of more than $1 billion in turnover, or businesses approaching that, if they have not had the blow of the COVID pandemic in the way that others more seriously have, then those companies, of course, are going to reach into their own resources to provide support to their employees, and many have, Mr Speaker. Companies, although Qantas have had significant support through JobKeeper, one of the most significant beneficiaries of JobKeeper, at the same time they have gone to the markets, they have raised capital, they have sought to keep as many people on as possible, and they have had one of the most significant blows. So, Mr Speaker, for those who find themselves without employment, JobSeeker is there, and they can earn up to now $300 a fortnight without that impacting their JobSeeker supports. And, Mr Speaker, I see the member for Blair throw his hands apart because he believes that JobSeeker is something less than JobKeeper, Mr Speaker. I don't have that view, Mr Speaker. I don't have that view. I know, Mr Speaker, that the combination of JobKeeper and JobSeeker in the next phase will combine together to give the supports that Australians need. And, Mr Speaker, we will ensure—
The member for Kingston, the Prime Minister's time has concluded. And I call the member for Barker.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, my question is to the Minister representing the Minister for Employment, Skills, Small and Family Businesses. Will the Minister outline to the House how the Morrison government is supporting small businesses to create every possible job they can to help secure our recovery from the COVID-19 recession?
The Minister for Industry, Science and Technology.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for his question. And I know that he has a very deep understanding of the challenges that small businesses are facing, particularly in rural and regional communities, such as his own in the electorate of Barker. Now, Mr Speaker, one of the ways that we're backing small businesses to create jobs is ensuring that they have the skilled workers that they need now and in the future. And we're doing that through the Job Trainer plan, because we understand that skilled workers are essential for productive businesses, particularly in regional Australia. And again, Mr Speaker, this is not just about a business bottom line. This is about people. It's mums, it's dads, it's grandparents wanting to ensure that their kids have the opportunities to get a skilled and well-paid job in their local region. And there's a fantastic example of that in the member for Barker's electorate with Bow Hills Engineering in the Murraylands. This is a multi-generational family business that's been growing for over 40 years. It started as a machinery repair shop and evolved into a steel fabrication business that was supplying industries including mining, water, defence and construction. Now, Mr Speaker, it's a great Australian manufacturing success story. And Jodie from Bow Hills is on the record as saying that she is stoked with our Job Trainer plan and that it would support her business, which currently has 15 apprentices. Now, she sums up the value of apprentices to her businesses, and I quote, "We've had 40 apprentices in total over the years, and we're incredibly proud of that. We identified years ago that our apprentices and trainees were our best and brightest, and we invested in that. There is so much potential within our local youth." And, Mr Speaker, that is exactly what Job Trainer is all about, developing the potential so that mums and dads can be assured that there is a pathway ahead for their kids, and it's helping businesses create every possible job that they can. Mr Speaker, Job Trainer is rapidly going to give more Australians access to free or low-cost training in areas of identified skills needs. But we're also investing $120 million to create apprenticeships in rural and regional Australia and $17.4 million in skills for mature age workers. It's all designed to make sure that small businesses and Australian industry have the skilled workforce that they need, because the skilled workforce is essential to the jobs now and of the future.
The member for Rankin.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Yesterday, the Reserve Bank Governor said unemployment is going to be higher for longer and, quote, still around 7% in 2 years' time. Why is the Prime Minister withdrawing support from the economy and the jobs market, which will make it even harder for Australians to find jobs and put food on the table?
The Treasurer.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. As the Governor of the Reserve Bank said just yesterday, the fundamentals of the Australian economy remain strong. And he's pointed out that unemployment will remain elevated for some time, and this is consistent with Treasury's view. And as I've just said to the House in an earlier question, unemployment today is at 7.5, and the expectation is it will reach around 10% by the end of the year. But as the honourable member for Rankin knows, the situation in Victoria has been a major drag on the national economy, with Treasury saying that up to 400,000 people in Victoria will either lose their jobs or see their hours reduced to zero, as that state is subject to stage 4 restrictions, Mr Speaker. And as a quarter of the national economy, the impact of what we're seeing in Victoria does have a much broader consequence for the country. Now, our JobKeeper program is continuing. It's expanding. It's being extended. And at $101 billion, it's the single largest program any Australian government has ever undertaken. And we are transitioning that program because 7 out of the 8 jurisdictions in this country are managing the virus. 7 out of the 8 jurisdictions in this country are managing the virus. But in my home state of Victoria, it's a different
Member
situation.
for Lyons is warned.
Now, Mr Speaker, the member for Rankin would like to pretend there hasn't been a once-in-a-century pandemic. The member for Rankin would ignore the fact that Victoria is in stage 4 restrictions. The member for Rankin would ignore the fact that we have undertaken the biggest single economic support program in Australia's history. The member for Rankin would ignore the fact that our contribution of $314 billion is around 15.8% of GDP, and the state contribution has been around $48 billion, or 2.4% of GSP. So, Mr Speaker, I'd say to the member for Rankin, pick up the phone to the Premier in Queensland, suggest that they spend more on infrastructure, more on social housing, more payroll tax relief, more land tax relief, and come with the Commonwealth. And as the minister knows, there are plenty of water projects that we are looking for additional Queensland investment and infrastructure. There are plenty of road projects that we are looking forward to increased expenditure in Queensland. So, Mr Speaker, we are doing everything in our power to get more Australians back to work. And the fact that of the 1.3 million Australians who lost their job or saw their hours reduced to zero since the start of the crisis, of those, around 700,000 are now back in work, shows that our JobMaker program is working.
And I call the member for Bass.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Attorney-General and Minister for Industrial Relations. Will the Attorney please outline to the House how the Morrison government is working to drive jobs growth across Australia, which is of a critical importance as we come out the other side of the COVID-19 recession?
The Attorney-General and Minister for Industrial Relations.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for her question, her hard work and her electorate and her representation of Tasmania. And as the member knows, today's figures highlight the importance of everything that we have done as a government to save jobs, everything that is being done to save more jobs, and all of the policies to create job growth into the future. And in terms of policies that have worked to save jobs, the industrial relations employment flexibilities that were built into the first round of JobKeeper were clearly a critical component of saving hundreds of thousands of Australian jobs. Without those flexibilities, many businesses would very likely have collapsed, costing jobs and livelihoods. And one example from the member's home state of Tasmania was a business employing 20 people, an events management business, and you can imagine how the turnover for that business was affected. They said JobKeeper flexibilities gave us the ability, when we stopped dead, to re-engineer the business, which was a very positive thing. Without the JobKeeper flexibilities, the business wouldn't have lasted in its pre-COVID form for 6 months and would have resulted in significant job losses. Worst-case scenario, we would have gone into liquidation and debt. And in a survey conducted of those businesses in the first round of JobKeeper, 80% of the respondent employers said that they viewed the industrial relations flexibilities as either important or essential for the continued operation of their business and keeping their employees in jobs. And 4 out of 5 of those employers supported extending the flexibilities for a further period of time, with those businesses citing job losses and business closure as being the most likely outcome if the flexibilities were removed. And that is why, with JobKeeper number 2, we had a plan for those legacy businesses who were coming back but were not yet out of the woods, those businesses that might still be down 15 or 20 or 25% in their turnover. That plan was allow them, subject to very clear protections for employees, to access those flexibilities for another 6 months, to help them get back to prosperity and job growth and save those jobs. That plan was clear. It was passed into law by this parliament. And the opposition, their position on that was simply to say, we don't agree with that. No plan, no alternative, just a no. And had that legislation not been successful and those flexibilities not extended, jobs would have been lost. Jobs would have been lost. This is an absolutely key part of ensuring that jobs are preserved and that jobs can be grown. And we now have unions and businesses who have spent in excess of 100 hours with each other, considering other ways and policies where they can reach agreement to grow jobs. And that process is going to be critical.
I call the member for Franklin.
My question is to the Prime Minister. Tony Abbott says older Australians with COVID should be left to die, and I quote, "while nature takes its course," close quote. Why hasn't the Prime Minister already condemned this heartless remark by a former Liberal Prime Minister?
The Prime Minister, members on both sides, the Prime Minister has the call.
Mr Speaker, right from the
Prime Minister, just before he begins, I'm reluctant to interrupt him, but I can hear the level of interjections. There's a number of people that have been warned, and I just warn them again. The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, I think all members of this House have known the government's position when it comes to the need to take action to protect the lives of all Australians during the COVID-19 pandemic, and we have acted in accordance with that very strong view. Mr Speaker, I don't accept, while I have not read every statement of the former Prime Minister, I do not understand that that was the intent of the Prime Minister's statement. Mr Speaker, I'm not aware, as I have not seen it. I've been focused on, Mr Speaker, a day when the member opposite maybe want to be reading speeches. My focus today has been on the millions of Australians who have received the news today that Australia has entered into the worst recession as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic, Mr Speaker, that we have seen in this country since the Great Depression. Now, Mr Speaker, that has not enabled me to be reading a lot of the matters that the member has referred to. But what I do know is what we have done, Mr Speaker. I do know what we have done. And I do know that our government's policies and our actions during the COVID-19 pandemic has been to value every single life, Mr Speaker. Every single life matters, Mr Speaker, when it comes to the COVID-19 pandemic and its impact on Australians right across this country. And that is how we've acted, and that is how we've responded, and the Australian people know that that is the policy of our government.
Call the member for Ford.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And my question is to the Minister for Resources, Water and Northern Australia. Will the minister outline to the House how the Morrison government is supporting our resources sector to create every possible job and help drive Australia's economic recovery from the COVID-19 recession?
The Minister for Resources, Water and Northern Australia.
Well, thank you for the call, Mr Speaker. Can I thank the honourable member for their question? And the member for Forde knows that even in those tough economic reports today, there is a ray of hope for the Australian people, and it is in the resources sector. And how does that affect the member? The member for Forde has the Caterpillar Distribution Centre at Yatala, so jobs in the member's electorate directly affected by the resources sector. Now, Mr Speaker, we know the coronavirus has hit regional Australia hard. We know it has hit Australia hard. And I am absolutely heartbroken for all of those individuals who have lost their jobs, who have lost hours, who have lost their businesses, who find themselves in incredibly difficult circumstances. But I say to each and every one of them, there is a ray of hope in the story today, and it is in the resources sector and it is in mining. And those numbers, Mr Speaker, are straightforward. The resources sector has grown 0.2%. It went up 0.2% in the June quarter, and that is up 1.1% compared to last year. So it is a sector which continues to grow and continues to provide jobs. And the industry is still investing in Australia. It is still investing in our country and our people and jobs. In fact, that investment is up 1.3% in the June quarter compared with the March quarter, and up 7.9% since June last year. That is $13.5 billion worth of investment in the last 3 months, $52 billion over the last financial year. Now, Mr Speaker, they are numbers, and those numbers probably don't mean a lot to most Australians. But what it does mean to each and every one of those is jobs and opportunity. There is hope in our economy. There is a path forward. We have a job maker plan, a plan for a recovery. And, Mr Speaker, I was in Mount Isa in recent weeks. Glencore at Mount Isa has more than 300 open positions right now. 300 jobs in Mount Isa, well paid, well trained and available for individuals that meet those needs. Mr Speaker, I met with an apprentice, an adult apprentice, taken up an electrician's job. Very partial electricians, Mr Speaker, as a former electrician, I have to say. And this individual had arrived in Mount Isa, towing a boat to visit a family member, and what happened? He got a job at the mine and he stayed. So he went to town for 2 weeks and he hasn't left for years. These are the stories of opportunity in regional Australia. These are the opportunities that we have for all Australians. The resources sector is a shining light in our economy. And I want to thank every single one of the working men and women in the resources sector who are doing everything they can to continue to build Australia's economy, to continue to build opportunities for us and our kids and those into the future. And they need to continue to do that because it is in the national interest. And for those who are opposed to the mining sector, Mr Speaker, I say shame on you, because where would we be positioned right now if not for this industry, if not for this sector, if not for the jobs that it provides, the taxes it pays, the royalties it pays for hospitals and roads?
The minister's time has concluded. The Leader of the Opposition.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. News Corp has launched the Aged Care 360 campaign to bring greater transparency to the aged care sector. Will the Prime Minister provide the transparency that families of aged care residents deserve, including the details of COVID infections and deaths by aged care facility, giving families exactly the same information that's available to the Prime Minister himself?
The Minister for Health.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. And very importantly, one of the things we've sought to do right from the outset when we set out in February the national strategy of containment to flatten the curve and capacity to build the ability to deal with every situation, to go to the question asked in the previous question, where we said we would seek to save every life, where we would fight for every life, because as the Prime Minister said then and again today, every life matters. Against that background, what we've sought to do is twofold. Firstly, to build that capacity within the aged care sector to ensure that there is funding, to ensure that there are the places. And what we've done is boost the capacity of the aged care sector from $13 billion to $22 billion, to $23 billion, to $24 billion and to $25 billion. In addition to that, each day now what we have is a report from the Victorian Aged Care Response Centre set up jointly with the Victorian Government. And that's on the activities and actions, and it's also on the outcomes and the sad losses that is provided by the Victorian Aged Care Response Centre. That is a joint partnership with the Victorian Government. That sets out the transfers, now over 480 transfers, for example, that have been carried out. That sets out the work of the ADF, and that sets out the terrible losses and figures.
Resume his seat. The Minister for Health needs to resume his seat. The Leader of the Opposition.
Thanks, Mr.
On
Speaker.
a point of order.
Yes, Mr. Speaker. It was a very specific question. News Corp's campaign goes to every state that News Corp tabloids are running, including the Courier Mail, the Daily Telegraph.
The Leader of the Opposition can resume his seat.
It's a specific question about the details of COVID infections.
Yes. The Leader of the House on the point of order.
The Minister was asked a question about the provision of information and then provides an answer about the provision of precisely the type of information that was asked, and he's clearly relevant.
Has the Minister completed his answer, or is he? Just before I call the Minister, I've listened to the point of order. I think the Minister was being relevant and then enlarging on the topic, but I'll listen carefully to his final point.
With regards to the figures on a state-by-state basis in terms of lives lost within aged care facilities, 0 in the ACT, 29 in New South Wales, 0 in Northern Territory, 1 in Queensland, none in South Australia, 3 in Tasmania, 433 in Victoria, 1 in Western Australia, 467 across Australia. I would note that the opposition has made much of the accuracy of particular figures. There are 2 occasions, and I would not have brought this to the attention of the House until the fact that the opposition seems to have raised this to a very high level.
I just say to the Minister he needs to stop there. That the members on my left, it's not an opportunity to answer a different question. The question was specific. He's stuck to the facts, but it did not talk about the opposition in any way, shape or form.
There were 2 occasions when the Leader of the Opposition
No, the Minister will resume his seat. The Minister will resume his seat. The member for Grey.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Agriculture, Drought and Emergency Management. Will the Minister outline to the House how the agricultural sector will play a significant role in supporting the Australian economy to emerge from the COVID-19 recession as part of the government's plan?
And I call the Minister for Agriculture.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for Grey for his question and acknowledge the contribution the electorate of Grey plays to not only South Australian agriculture but also to the Australian agricultural industry. And over the last 18 months, farmers not only in Grey but right across the country have faced numerous challenges: drought, fire, floods in northwest Queensland, and now COVID-19. But despite the challenges that they've faced, they've continued to just get on with the job. They've been the economic backbone of this country at the start of this COVID pandemic in making sure that we were fed and clothed. And despite these challenges, we should be proud of the fact that Australian agriculture this financial year will actually increase to $61 billion. That's an enormous result, considering the challenges that our Australian agricultural industry has faced. And some gleaming examples of that is around the export of meat and live animals is up 35% on the 5-year average. Horticultural exports are up 34% on the 5-year average. And this year's winter crop will, in fact, beat the 10-year average. Such has been the rain that we've received across many parts of eastern Australia. That's a real advantage for those farmers, but more importantly, those communities that support them. And we've tried to support them not only through the drought, with over $10 billion worth of support in commitments. It is also, in terms of northwest Queensland floods, with over $3 billion. And with the fires, over $2 billion in direct assistance. And now, and we talk about one of the key measures around the drought, was a $4 billion investment in the Regional Investment Corporation, allowing farmers to refinance up to $2 million of their debt from a commercial bank with no interest and no repayments for 2 years. That would save a farmer, just on interest only at 6%, around $120,000 a year. That is money we're taking out of big banks' pocket and putting back into farmers' pockets. We're allowing them to also use that to replant and restock. They need time for their budgets and their cash flows to repair, and that takes time, and this, giving them that interest-free, repayment-free period allows them to do that. But what happens when you do that for farmers? You put money back in their pockets. They invest it back in their business with better efficiency and productivity, but they invest it back in their local communities. And it's been complemented by the instant asset write-off, lifting the cap to $150,000. And what that's done is, as we've seen since July, when this came in, up to July, there has been a 24% increase in the number of tractor sales, 33% in terms of balers and 14% in terms of front mowers. That's a significant investment, putting money back into local communities. We're seeing economic growth in these communities from these measures that are supporting not just agriculture, it's supporting regional communities. Because if we support agriculture and we support regional Australia, it's good for all of Australia.
The member for Rankin.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Yesterday, the Treasurer admitted that only $85 billion of the $314 billion of economic support has been delivered by the government. Are today's figures better or worse because the Prime Minister failed to deliver most of the support he announced for families and businesses doing it tough in the worst recession for almost 100 years?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The commitment that the government has made through the JobKeeper program, through the Job Seeker program, through the cash flow support, through the many measures, whether they be home builder, job trainer, all of these programs, Mr Speaker, that are designed, including the balance sheet support that has been provided by the Reserve Bank, of which, Mr Speaker, there has already been some $50 billion of support through that program to keep rates low and to support the investments that are being made by businesses. These investments that are being made by the Australian government are not just for today. They're for tomorrow. They're extended out to the end of March, and indeed in many of these programs well beyond that. Now, the Shadow Treasurer may be unaware that when you make funding commitments, you do it over the not just now, but over the next few years. Mr. Speaker, that is how budgets work. I know the Shadow Treasurer has never put a budget together, Mr Speaker, and I know these are not matters that he may be well versed in when his mentor on this, Mr Speaker, was former Treasurer Swan. But I can let the Shadow Treasurer know that the support we have announced is not just for today, it's for tomorrow, and it's for the many months and quarters ahead, and in some cases for years ahead, Mr Speaker. Because what is important as we move through this crisis is we give that support both today and for tomorrow, but importantly we provide the road back for Australian businesses as they seek to make their way out. Mr Speaker, today's news is terrible news. It's devastating news, Mr Speaker, and while it is true that we have been able to, through the measures we've put in place, to cushion the blow, with the expenditure already undertaken and the expenditure still to come, which Australians can count on because it's been committed in the way we've set out, we have been able to, as a country, despite the very significant outbreak we've had more recently in Victoria, we have been able to, so much more than so many other countries around the world today, been able to suppress this virus. And the same has been true to mitigate the impact and far more devastating economic impacts that have been experienced in so many other places. A 13% fall through the year in Canada, a 19% fall in France, an 11.3% fall in Germany, a 10% fall in Japan, a 9% fall in the United States, a 21.7% fall in the United Kingdom, and in Australia a 6.3% fall. Devastating as that is, Mr Speaker, what I can also say is the death rate in Canada is 9 times higher than Australia. It's 18 times higher than France. It's 4 times higher in Germany. Mr Speaker, it's 21 times higher in the United States and 23.8 times higher in the United Kingdom. Australia, Mr Speaker, is getting the balance right to save lives and livelihoods in a crisis.
I call the member for Barara.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Population, Cities and Urban Infrastructure. Will the minister outline to the House how the Morrison government, through its continued investment in critical infrastructure, is working to create every possible job and support our economy as we come out the other side of the COVID-19 recession?
And I call the Minister for Population, Cities and Urban Infrastructure.
Well, can I thank the member for Barara for his question. As the Prime Minister just pointed out, the national accounts
figures have been devastating, and behind all of those job losses, of course, are individual families, extended friends and loved ones, and they're all feeling it. So our great task is to rebuild those jobs over the years ahead, and one of the big levers that we have, as the member alluded to, is through our infrastructure investment program. As members would know, we have a $100 billion investment program, and that means projects right around Australia are being undertaken right now. Since November of last year, we've actually brought forward new money, $10 billion of extra funding into the forward estimates to get more projects even underway and get more jobs underway. One of those very large-scale projects in the member for Browra's electorate, of course, is North Connects. And that project alone, which I know the Prime Minister and Deputy Prime Minister, along with the member for Browra, visited it just recently, it itself is creating 8,700 jobs, a massive jobs boost for that area, and of course will have a huge impact across the northern suburbs of Sydney when it's complete as well, taking 5,000 trucks off Pennant Hill Road in the process. And that's just one major project which is underway right now. Across Sydney, we've just recently announced, as the member for Lindsay is aware, the Western Sydney Airport Rail. That itself will be underway later this year, and 14,000 jobs, Mr Speaker, will be created just in that project alone, and that, of course, is on top of the 10,000 plus jobs being created during the construction phase of the Western Sydney Airport itself. Down in Victoria, where we need so many jobs because we've been hit so hard down there with the restrictions, later this year we're going to see the monster North East Link project get underway. That itself will be 10,000 further jobs for the residents of Melbourne, and geez, we need those jobs, Mr Speaker. Of course, the contribution we're making to the M1, as the member for Latrobe knows so well, equally creating thousands of jobs, as is the M80 and so many other projects. We have other projects creating thousands of jobs around the rest of Australia, be it the MetroNet in Perth, as the member for Curtin knows and other members know, as well as in Adelaide, in Tasmania and elsewhere. Mr Speaker, this is such an important part of our recovery efforts. We've got projects underway now. There'll be more to come because it creates jobs, which means supporting families, supporting livelihoods and getting us back on track.
The Prime Minister. Thank you, Mr Speaker. I ask that further questions be placed on the notice paper.
The Prime Minister.